Whether you love Metaphor ReFantazio or hate it, I want you here for this one because today we're going to be looking at negative Steam reviews of the game. As someone who has literally originated and discovered hidden secrets and symbolisms within this game's story, it would be fair to say that I don't just like this game, I also probably understand it at a deeper level than most. That said, I don't know about y'all, but I'm always fascinated when people have very different opinions about a game or a character or a story. It intrigues me, and I often find I leave the intersection of our different opinions with more understanding than before I had encountered the opposition viewpoint. Now, as I alluded to before, while it is true that I am the character analysis guy for this game we love and cherish, Metaphor ReFantazio, this video will have a more chill conversational vibe, so I hope you still enjoy, and please let me know your thoughts as you watch. Now let's have a look.
If JRPGs aren't your game, this one won't change your mind.
Can I just say right out the gates that that's like saying, that's like saying Halo won't change your mind if you don't like shooters. Like, if you don't like a genre of game, then even the best games from that genre probably won't change your mind, and there's nothing wrong with that, but to have that be one of the reasons that you're giving this game a thumbs down is just like, okay.
For a Game of the Year contender, I had a very frustrating experience. The first 20 hours are fine, but the game drags on and on and on. For perspective, the game has a difficulty called Story Mode, which when you die in battle, you can just revive and continue. I did this for the last 20 hours of the game, because I just wanted to see the end of the story. And on the last boss, and this boss alone.
I don't know, does the game drag on or does it just continue? Like, again, this feels like one of those things where it's like, if you're not a certain type of person, then you're just naturally not going to enjoy the framework and type of game that this is. It's a long game. So it's like, if you don't have the attention span for a game that lasts longer than 20 hours, then it's probably just not the game for you, because this game requires you to, one of the big strengths of this game is it plants seeds, and then you watch the seeds grow in terms of the characters, the storylines, even the gameplay, like the amount of archetypes that you unlock over time. That's just how the game is. So it's like, I don't know if I consider that actual fair and legitimate criticism in my book.
I had to endure 2 hours straight of dying and reviving. Boss rolls 14 turns of animations you can't skip.
Did you have to endure that, or is it just a skill issue? Again, like, it's not a fair criticism of a game to say that I'm bad at it, so I died over and over to the final boss. You know what I mean? There are built-in systems into the gameplay that allow you to mitigate against when a boss has a lot of turns.
I don't get these games. I get D&D, but this... Nope. For someone who tries to finish what he starts, this was murder.
Well, you said it right there in your own review. You don't get these games. And that's okay, but I mean, is your lack of understanding a good reason to legitimately say that this isn't a good game or to thumb it down? I mean, like, myself, for example, I made a video a while ago about Baldur's Gate 3 and how the gameplay systems in that game, personally, they just weren't, what I personally enjoy as a gamer. But at the same time, I acknowledge that the game was a masterpiece, and I was sure to say that, like, it's a game that deserves all of its accolades. So it's like, there's a way to separate criticism and personal bias when it comes to, talking about games that you might enjoy less than others.
It seems only 6% of players actually finish the game per Steam achievement. Says a lot, so I don't understand how this game is so highly rated.
This actually isn't true at all, and it's kind of a microcosm for this entire review. Honestly, it showcases your complete lack of understanding of this game. A little bit under 40% of players have actually finished this game, not the 6%. The 6% is for the stat of players who beat Luis at his maximum power. So again, that's just the end of this review is just the perfect microcosm for how much this player understood what was happening as they played this game. They didn't understand very much.
I really want to like this game. Sadly, I can't because everything.
So everything about this game is bad? Yeah, we're off to a great start.
The story feels like it goes at a crawl and at lightning speeds at the same time. How and why, and it stresses me out. The art direction is awesome. Outside of Camp WTF is that. The combat is the worst POS turn-based combat I've ever played. Does agility mean nothing to you, Atlas? Ooh, I know, let's have our heroes go one at a time, with no order established between enemy turns and friendly ones. So funny. Please kill me.
The combat is the worst. I mean, there's definitely a certain point where you can't really take a review seriously. I mean, I just don't understand how the story would be crawling and also going at lightning speed. Like, fundamentally, I can't even conceptualize how that effect would even be achieved if you tried it, so don't really understand that. Comments that are rooted so deeply in illogic, it's not even worth our time to try to logically refute. I mean, is this game's combat system literally the worst? No.
You had it. OPAF in Persona 5, then you fix it in Persona 3. Reload, and then you shit this out? Why just make the turn-based combat people like please? And I'm not complaining because it isn't Persona, I'm complaining because it sucks.
I mean, but it does kind of feel like you're complaining because it's not Persona. None of the criticisms were legitimate, and you made a direct reference to Persona 5 and Persona 3, so okay. Just say you're a Persona fanboy and move on. It's okay.
The first 50-some odd hours of it are introduction. When it finally starts, it's the end of the game.
Like, where do you even get that? That doesn't even make sense. The first 50... That doesn't even make sense. I don't even... It's just so illogical, I don't even know what to say.
Awful experience, and total letdown for someone who expected a new IP from Atlus. They literally just removed monster collecting and crafting entirely and replaced it with the most confusing and awful system to exist in the SMT franchise. And for what? It's literally the exact same spells and logic from all the other games, but worse.
On the monster collecting point, you basically asked why. How about narrative purposes? They had a story that they wanted to tell with the archetypes, and they went for it. There's no room within the narrative for monster collecting, if you will. I don't really understand how archetypes are confusing. In fact, I'd argue that it is less confusing than the traditional monster collecting, if you will, from the Persona or SMT games. And again, once we venture into that realm of hyperbole, I mean, most confusing and awful system to exist, I mean, at that point, we're not dealing with logic, we're not dealing with a rational person, so we shouldn't even, engage with that point.
Probably the most offensive thing about this game is its attempts to be Persona 5.
So the most offensive thing about this game is its attempt to be Persona 5, but at the same time, you're lambasting it for doing something different than Persona 5.
Its combat, social ranks, and timed quests exist only to be familiar enough with Persona 5 fans to sell copies.
I mean, that statement really doesn't make sense. It's literally like saying Call of Duty, it's literally like saying that you're only shooting guns in Call of Duty so that the game is like the last Call of Duty. Like, it's just a genre of game, it's a style of game. That's not a fault against it.
Remember in Persona 5 when you could gain tactical advantage by engaging enemies stealthily? Well, you still kind of can. Except now, you have to fidget awkwardly around them and smash attack multiple times, instead of being able to hide behind things and jump the enemy from behind.
It's just a weird and very specific thing to focus on, like the fact that you missed the ambush mechanic from Persona 5. Okay, I don't know what we do with that.
When overworld combat is this clunky and unsatisfying, why not just have it be like it was in... The answer, we have to be Persona 5 in order to sell copies. What about social links? Well, yeah, they exist. Except in this game, it's a literal death sentence if you don't find out which links are worth maxing out or not.
I don't know if that's true. To be honest, I don't really see that being true. It just kind of feels like a skill issue.
Unlike Persona 5, where you can really just make the best out of whatever your social links you end up having maxed out or not. So if social links feel so terrible, and without a doubt, lock you out of extremely important archetypes, then why does it exist?
I don't know where that narrative comes from, because there's a lot of time in this game that you can spend. Like, when I came to the end, it's actually probably the most forgiven I've played from the Atlus games. Like, when I got to the end, I had like a whole extra week of just, I had to just spend the time because I had nothing else to do. So I don't know where this idea comes from where you can get locked out of important archetypes. There's plenty of time to meet plenty of people in the game and link up with them. And I don't feel like there's that many social links, to be honest. So I really don't know where that narrative comes from.
Because we have to look like Persona 5 in order to sell more copies. There's genuinely no reason to play this game, especially if this is your first time playing an Atlus JRPG. If you really want to experience the only good thing about this game, you can do so by simply Googling Metaphor OST. Otherwise, you may as well just replay Persona 5, as it appears that's all Atlus has any interest in producing anymore.
This is just a very strange hyperfixation on Persona 5, to be honest. So a lot of rampant hypocrisy in this review. It's saying that Metaphor is too much like Persona 5, while at the same time saying that it needs to be more like Persona 5. Just very strange. A very strange review.
Fantasy is dead. An unfinished mess too ambitious for its own good.
Right out the gates, I'm curious to see what metric they're going to use to claim that this game is unfinished, because I don't think there's any objective metric that you can use to claim that this game is unfinished.
Let me start off by saying I commend Atlus for trying something new, and I'm glad people enjoy it. I want Atlus to succeed and make new things. Coming from Persona 4 and 5, however, I found this game to be very flawed and disappointing. I appreciate the risk, but I also have to give honest critique. Abridged review, plot summary, and criticism.
Okay, just rehashing the game, we don't really need to see that.
We then start our journey through Uchronia, battling adversaries along the way, and work to gain more followers to stay in the race. Despite our interest in breaking the Prince's curse, we never investigate or find concrete proof of who cast it.
I mean, the entire reason that you don't investigate who cast the curse is because the game's very clear in telling you that everybody is convinced that Luis cast the curse. That's like a huge plot point to not understand. That's an entire plot point that Forden put the blame on Luis. That was his masterstroke. That was his magnum opus of a move to, you know, sweep multiple pieces off of the board. So, I mean, the reason you don't investigate is because you don't think that you need to.
Once the Cursed Prince plot is resolved, the story completely loses track of all character goals and motivation for the remainder of the game.
Definitely don't agree with the idea that the game loses track of character goals and motivation. Something that you need to understand with stories is that a good story has characters who evolve throughout. So the reasons for wanting to do things grow and evolve and change as different external factors change. So I feel like that's actually one of the strong points of this game. There are very natural progressions from where people start versus where they end. Stroll's parents instilled in him a very high standard of character and moral responsibility, and so it evolves from the start of the game that he doesn't just want vengeance. It naturally evolves for him that he feels a moral responsibility for helping everybody in the country as a noble. I think I could go through every single character honestly, but I don't want to spend too much time on this one single point. I just say that given who the characters are and given what their experiences have been in the world of Uchronia, it makes sense for every single one of them to want to consolidate their power behind the prince and change the world for the better. It's a very natural progression for all of them.
It's a whodunit mixed with a morally confused good versus evil story.
I don't know, is this... I feel like the whole storyline about who cursed the prince was overall kind of minor in the overarching scheme of the story. Like, I don't consider that to be a major plot point. It's just one of the components. Definitely feel like there's a little bit extra emphasis placed on that with this person. I'm not sure why. You see, so this is what I mean. Like, some people just be saying stuff. Like, it's a morally confused good versus evil story. What is the grounding for that? Like, what is the evidence for that? What is your reasoning for saying that? Because it's a pretty wild claim. So why are you saying that? So like, that's my whole thing. Like, given the fact that I do understand his story, I literally can't even understand how you could suggest that any morals are confused. I don't think layers and a lot of food for thought equates to moral confusion, but maybe that's just me. The world is not black and white, so that's something I appreciate about this story, is it's not black and white. It seems like this person expected a black and white story.
Any meaningful metaphor gets buried under its reluctance to engage in wider systemic critique.
I don't understand what they mean by reluctance to engage in a wider systemic critique.
The existence of Magla undercuts the metaphor they're trying to create. None of us seem to have a real motivation to win the competition besides beating Lewis. Something he points out. It's only a means to save the prince from the curse until it no longer isn't.
I mean, the motivation is not wanting your country to go to fucking shit. Like, what do you mean there's no real motivation? Luis doesn't point out what you're saying here. What Luis says is he's confused about why you're hyper-fixated on killing him. Basically because he's just one of the candidates in the race. But obviously the context there that he puts together and you put together is that you think that he cursed the prince, and so you're trying to, you know, kill the caster. Luis doesn't say, oh, you have no motivation to win the tournament.
From here on, the story is left in complete shambles. The story devolves into moral absolutism and self-grandeur it has not earned.
See, this just tells me that you have a very deep misunderstanding of the game's story. I would actually argue that this game conveys the opposite of moral absolutism. For those of you who don't know, moral absolutism is the belief that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of the context or consequences, and that these moral principles are universal and that they apply to everyone. I think that literally one of the main points of this game is that they really dig in and go deep into the idea that you can't just make widespread changes under what your moral code is, because that wouldn't be an effective way to rule. Like, this game is very deliberate in telling you that, hey, You can't just be a good guy and, everything's going to be fixed. In fact, aside from the fact that they tell you this with the 1 year time skip where the world isn't a utopia, and aside from the fact that they tell you that Moore's literal utopia that he wrote about probably wouldn't actually work in real life, there's another thing that supports this, and that is Barden's social link. The entire point of Barden's social link is to convey to you that just being a good and righteous person, who Barden is, he's righteous, he's selfish, he's a great man, everyone looks up to him, and so they put him in charge. Just because he was all those things did not make him an effective ruler. They went way out of their way just to show us that that wasn't enough. So the idea that this game preaches moral absolutism is just literally wrong. Like, it does the exact opposite of that. And then self-grandeur also makes zero sense. Again, for those of you who don't know, self-grandeur is like, it's an inflated sense of one's own importance, inflated sense of their powers, their abilities. So it's basically the belief that you are superior or unique to others. Again, this game tells you the exact opposite. I mean, we could talk about how literally in the epilogue, the prince is basically living amongst the people to get their genuine feedback so that he can better rule. Like, that is not self-grandeur, that is the opposite of self-grandeur. That is the game telling us that, the prince is the most powerful person in the kingdom, and yet he's humble enough to go and speak to people who literally spent the game, racially abusing him. Like, this is why some of this shit I can't take seriously, because they're just so far off it. The lack of understanding of what they are actually experiencing is so severe that it becomes a genuine waste of time. But, I hope it's at least entertainment for y'all.
It attempts to deliver on its high concept ideas, but it's clear this was beyond the capabilities of the writers.
Beyond the capabilities of the writers? This is beyond the capabilities of your comprehension. It's not on the writers.
Characters and world. Criticism: the world is mainly contrasted in Utopia, a book the protagonist read throughout the game. Utopia describes a version of our world where everything works ideally. However, you never seem to internalize or embody any of these ideas. This makes not just the main character, but all his friends forgettable.
So you're suggesting that the characters are forgettable because they don't follow the script that Moore has in his book? I don't understand that one. It's just such a weird thing to hyperfixate on. Like, you're mad that the characters don't act more like the utopian ideals from Moore's book, even though it was a plot point, a very this is what I'm talking about, man. Like, that was such an important plot point that they come to the end of the journey, and also every time the characters read something from the book, they have a minor note at the end where they're like, but hey, is that really utopia because XYZ? For example, with Heisme, he's like, well, we're talking about equality here, but what we really need is equity. That's his reaction to the book. And at the end of the game, where Moore tries to sell you on this fake reality, it's like, that's when Moore, the author of the book, realizes that your ideals surpass the book's ideals. Like, that's a big part of the story, that utopian ideals alone are not what's gonna fix society. So, like, again, so for you to sit here and say that because the characters aren't acting like the utopian ideals from the book, that makes them forgettable, all it does for me is showcase your severe lack of understanding of what this game is trying to convey to us.
It very much feels as if they're all written by the same person speaking in different voices. There's very little contrast or discernible qualities to tell them apart.
Oh my god. There's so much wrong with this. Very little contrast or discernible qualities to tell them apart? Oh my god. Like, what? This is what we call hating? This is just literal, just hating behavior. It's not grounded in reality. Like, what are we doing? Heisme's a grief-stricken dad who lost his child. Stroll lost everything and everyone he loved in a fire, and he's a noble from the countryside. Hulkenberg is from an extremely high-up royal family, and she joined the honor guard, and she protected the prince and was there the night he got cursed. Juna is literally a famous songstress Yufa is a priestess of a village, of a culture that is completely separate to everything you know on the mainland. Basilio was literally one of Luis's right-hand men for most of the story. Like, these are completely different people with different experiences, different backgrounds, and in fact, I don't think these people could get any more discernible from each other. I literally don't think they could.
It's not helped by the fact that despite having talented voice actors, they're all directed to give the same monotone, boring delivery.
Honestly, saying this game has monotone, boring delivery might be the biggest crime that we encounter today in this entire video. Like, that is an obscene sentence that I just read. I might insert a clip right here of just some iconic lines from the game, and you can tell me, hey, listen, even if you hate this game, I want you to listen to these clips and you tell me if you would consider it monotone.
My name is Leon Stroll de Haliatus. My home and my family were taken from me. I am the last of my house and the last of my noble bloodline. And in the name of my people, I will strike you down where you stand!
I am knight, I am commander, and last of the honor guards! Once more, I take up arms in my liege's name!
He was a helpless child, left to die in a pool of his own blood. By the time I finally got to him, it had been hours. It was too late.
I know, Del, but he makes all them speeches about equality, but in the end, he's gonna leave the weak to die. I heard him talk about his ideal world, and it sounds like a world where we'd have died alone in the dirt. No Saint Rella to save us. Is that what we're fighting for?
Now, onward, O King of a new dawn!
Characters are given nothing to do and no time to bond with you in the story. Their roles could have been easily filled by a taxi service and arms for hire. I struggle to connect with characters who seemingly never go through anything or grow throughout the game.
Nah, this is rage bait. This can't be real. This is, I don't know, whoever Atlus's biggest op is, this is them. This is literally them undercover writing this review, because there's no way. The characters never go through anything? Every single character in the game is formed from tragedy. What do you mean they never go through anything? Basilio's brother fucking dies right in front of us in the middle of the story. What do you mean? Juna's sister dies in the middle of the story. What are we talking about? Like, what? Oh my god. What the fuck? What am I reading, dog? What am I reading? Oh my god. Oh. Y'all, I don't know if I'm gonna make it through all these reviews. This is nuts.
Most of their sub-stories are static shots of poorly written dialogue. Most of their issues could have been solved on their own. You didn't need to be there.
Honestly, so right now I'm actually working on my analysis for the prince, the main character, the protagonist. Some of you call him Will. But that's actually, you know, one of the core things that I have established in that video is the exact surprise, the exact opposite of what this fucking Joker is saying. The idea that their issues could have been solved, the entire point of their social links, I would actually argue that the social links in this game are probably the main thing that conveys to you your importance to the people and your importance to the story, because a lot of times in the main story beats, you kind of take a back seat just because you do know less than your other teammates. You know, Stroll leads a lot, but the social links is where you really shine, because in every single social link, it is the protagonist's ability to be empathetic and be present and be an active listener and, you know, to reinforce and validate the experiences of everybody else within his social link. It is that personality and that trait that is consistent across every single social link. So the idea that they could have solved the issues on their own and you didn't need to be there, that's just absolutely insane. Again, I'm convinced this is from Atlus's biggest op, just, you know, slamming the company. Oh man.
Technical and graphical criticism. The game is an ugly mess. It looks unfinished and unpleasant. Texture assets look like unfinished placeholders. The campsites look like you're out of bounds, and excessive copy pasting are just a few issues I have. The cities and boss battles are the graphical highlights, however you'll spend most of the time inside and close up on low quality assets. Even with the update, SMAA does very little to eliminate shimmering and jagged edges. Everything looks like an over-sharpened Switch game. You can usually make out the same 5 to 6 characters for crowds.
Okay, so this part, honestly, I feel like this criticism is fair, but at the same time, it's like, are you even trying to enjoy the game that you're playing? Like, it just feels a little bit nitpicky. It's like giving the energy of like playing an RPG and the whole world looks beautiful, and then you go out of your way to like go into this corner of the map where there's nothing but this bush, and then you complain about the bush not being rendered properly. Like, that's the energy that is giving, and it's just like, it's like masochistic, honestly. That's what it sounds like your experience with this game was. Like, it sounds like you just tortured yourself for no reason, honestly. I think in my own video comparing Metaphor ReFantazio versus Persona 5 Royal, and just giving like a very general review of the game and talking about, you know, some of the qualms that I had about the game, I think I might have mentioned stuff about the graphics being slightly disappointing to me, considering how much longer this baked in the oven relative to when Persona 5 came out. So I do understand like criticizing the graphics, but it's giving like very nitpicky energy here. Calling the game an ugly mess is just, no, it's not. It's not perfect, but it's not that.
Each city serves as a hub with different quests and items with little to no reason for visiting cities later on. They don't update their stock as you progress, meaning cities you've been to have worse items in stock and nothing to offer. Scenes are poorly directed. Characters mostly stand still, doing absolutely nothing and barely emote. The lip sync is terrible and distracting. I honestly prefer looking at the dialogue portraits more than the in-game models. Load times are pretty fast, which helps a lot when the game is divided into multiple hubs and smaller sized areas.
Again, so I agree, the lip sync is pretty bad. City hubs could have been done better, but for me personally, in my opinion, I do think they are serviceable.
Balance and combat. The game is poorly balanced and the combat underdeveloped. Central mechanics are relegated to missable tutorial prompts and never taught to the player through gameplay. Early game combat is tedious. Hours of grinding is required.
Just wrong. The combat is great in this game, and I don't think it's poorly balanced.
Every archetype starts at level 1 across characters. There are 47 in total. If you want to experiment, you have to grind plus 300 archetypes.
I don't know if it's intentional, probably is, because this guy's a hater, but the way he phrased it is pretty disingenuous. He phrases it as you have to go character by character by character and grind each archetype one at a time. It's obviously not the case. Every character gets XP from the battles that you go through, so realistically, you only have to grind the amount of archetypes that there are, which would be 47. You don't actually grind over 300 archetypes.
This offers very little flexibility and opportunities early on and can even get you soft-locked. This was not an issue in Persona, where the main character could freely switch between personas during combat. Had combat been less rigid and unforgiving, I would have maybe been more favorable to this new weakness-based system.
I mean, getting soft-locked in this game is literally just a skill issue, to be honest. My whole thing is like, if I'm bad at a game, again, I talked about this with the Baldur's Gate 3 video that I did a long time ago, but just the way I am as a gamer, that game, I was not made for that game. I was not good at that game. I can acknowledge that. I wouldn't blame the game itself. I wouldn't blame the game systems and say that they're bad just because I can't easily play it. I'm just tired of people conveying skill issues as issues with the game itself. You know what I mean?
System. Elite Archetypes is a late game unlock that has a ton of contingencies for every character. You'll barely have time to use it before the end of the game, and it will remain unavailable in Unknown Plus until the same point in the story.
Okay, I do agree about the Royal Archetypes issue. I talked about that in my Persona 5 Royal and Metaphor ReFantazio video. I just really feel like they should have been available. Well, I feel like at least the roster of archetypes should have been available from the start of New Game Plus. I don't feel the royal archetypes should have been available from the start because the royal archetypes essentially make all other archetypes obsolete. So I'm fine with them unlocking at the point in the story where they unlock. But yeah, I feel like all the other archetypes, for example, one of my big issues with the game was like Dragoon. Like, that's a cool fucking archetype. I don't know if I ever used it. I might have used it for 1 or 2 battles, and it's unfortunate because I really did want to use it. I was looking forward to it for a long time, but just because of when you unlock it versus where you'll be in the story, you'll have royal archetypes, so there will basically be no need for you to use it. And that goes for, you know, a lot of other archetypes in the game as well, unfortunately. So yes, I do agree on that point that honestly, New Game Plus, there were a lot of missed opportunities when it came to the gameplay and the combat.
Real-time combat is admittedly a nice addition. However, this is a real pain against stronger enemies who will lunge over great distances and out of view of the camera. This leads to a lot of unfair and frustrating encounters.
Again, that's just a skill issue. That's literally a skill in third-person action games, managing your camera so you know where all the enemies are at a certain point in time, and you know, relative to your positioning, where you're safe and where you can attack and when you can defend. That's a skill issue.
Bad weather makes it impossible to hit enemy weaknesses, making the game unplayable. In order to change the weather, you'll need to cook almighty golden stew for grown-ass man Ideni, even after saving his sister.
You better cook him his stew. My man's a chief, man. He's working hard on that village. You better cook him his damn stew, and I don't want to hear you complaining about it, all right?
You can only cook these meals while the gauntlet runner is traversing with difficult-to-find ingredients.
Okay, so the guy said difficult to find ingredients as if that was a bad thing. It just feels like he is raging at the fact that he was bad at this game, and now everything stems from that. Like, the fact that this game was challenging for them.
Menu and UI. Going from the fantastic menu of Persona 5, where text was readable, had a sense of flow and intuitive layout, the ReFantazio UI is a nightmare. There's a constant fast-moving graphic effect on background elements that constantly draws your eyes away from text. Menus look too similar to distinguish and can be very confusing during battles when skills and synthesis look the same to players. It's a sensory nightmare and exhausting to use. This is style above everything else. It's not practical or usable. It is snappy, but this only makes it more chaotic and disorienting.
Okay, so for me, I think the menu and UI is brilliant. I love looking at it. I think it's beautiful, but I can concede that, you know, maybe for someone with more sensitive eyes, they probably should have included a more accessible option where, you know, everything's static and there's nothing moving around and there's more contrast between the words and the graphics and whatnot. So I do concede on that point for sure.
Music and sound. The OST is quite excellent, Warriors of Valor being a highlight. There is, however, only about 2 hours worth of music spread over a nearly 70-hour-long game. For comparison, Persona 5R has an 8-hour-long soundtrack across 125 hours of gameplay. I wish the OST was longer and also had more calm tracks. Some of them can be quite loud and demanding of the listener. I found myself being fatigued by the constant blaring music menu and characters talking. This is not the fault of the composer, but rather the game director. I also feel that the mixing is not quite there. I rarely ever mess around with the in-game mixer, but this game is very loud and in-your-face sound design overall is serviceable. I don't think it does anything impressive or special and is drowned out by the loud music most of the time.
Okay, so I'm shocked, but I basically agree overall on the music segment. It's just so funny because there's so much with this review that I really didn't like, but you know, towards the end, there were a few things that I kind of agree with. It kind of felt like maybe they started writing this review and they were crashing out a little bit, and then by the end they had calmed down and were being a little bit more objective. But yeah, I do kind of agree that while this is a subjective topic, I do feel like Persona 5's music was really, really... Well, that's the thing, right? Is it fair for us to compare this game's soundtrack to Persona 5's soundtrack and say, well, Metaphor's soundtrack should have been better? I don't know if that's fair because Persona's soundtrack is arguably... I feel like it's a soundtrack that you could literally make an argument that it is the best soundtrack in video game history. Like, it's at that level, and to expect that from every single Atlus release probably isn't realistic, but, you know, they make some fair points where it's like, if this is a standard that you have, then at least create a certain amount of music, right? Like, at least have the soundtrack be maybe a similar length to Persona's, but I feel like Metaphor still, if you're putting it on a general video game scale, I feel like Metaphor soundtrack is still an amazing soundtrack. I've got some songs added to my playlist, so that's the mark right there.
Conclusion. I really wanted to like the game, but it simply has too many issues for me to ignore. I gave it the 100% completion treatment and made sure to learn everything I could to give the game a fair chance. They seem to have completely forgotten many of the previous lessons I thought they'd learned from the Persona franchise. It's very much 2 steps back, 1 step forward. I sadly am not excited to see more metaphors from Atlus anytime soon.
Okay, so it's kind of scary for me because the last few points in the conclusion, I can kind of start to understand what this person is talking about. It kind of feels like I'm looking at, the trope, 2 sides, same coin. It kind of feels like I'm looking at the other side of the coin relative to me and my opinion of the game. While they have some inexcusable misunderstandings about the game's narrative and the game's gameplay system, evidently, there are some points that they made where it's like, okay, I kind of see what you're saying. Like, that was the root of my Persona 5 Royal versus Metaphor ReFantazio video that I did. Just like that feeling, I just had that feeling after I finished this game where I was like, I don't know, I was just slightly disappointed about the lessons that I would have assumed they had learned from having Persona 5 Royal released so far before this game and having like so many years of fan feedback and so many years of like that game kind of like sitting out, where it's like, I don't know, there's just a few things that were kind of frustrating with this game that they didn't amend or they just stayed stagnant on. So I do understand that sentiment, but I'm just so far away from how harshly they speak about this game. 2 steps back, 1 step forward is kind of crazy. I think I would personally say that it's 2 steps to the right, like it's a similar level to Persona 5. I think this is still an amazing game on its own right, but it's different, and there are a lot of differences that are to be celebrated and enjoyed. But yeah, overall, I feel like this person is a little bit more hinged than I thought they were at the start. Maybe it's not one of Atlus's ops. Maybe it's just someone who, played the game and felt the way that they felt.
It's difficult to review Metaphor without comparing it to its peers, the Shin Megami Tensei and Persona games, and this is due in large part to its insistence on clinging to mechanics from these games. Make no mistake, Metaphor is, essentially, just Persona with a different coat of paint, similar enough that I feel into I can confidently call it a Persona game, but different enough that I wish they had taken it a little further. Let's go through these mechanics one at a time.
See, I'm not so sure I agree with this sentiment. I do believe this game exists in the same genre as Persona, but I do think that there's so much different about it, and there's enough different about it that I wouldn't call it, I definitely wouldn't call it a Persona game. To me, I know I keep going back to this hypothetical or adjacent to this hypothetical a lot, but I feel like calling Metaphor just a Persona game would be the same as saying that Battlefield is just Call of Duty. You know what I'm saying? Like, they're different games in different franchises and they do a lot of different things. Are they shooters? Yes. Do they both have multiplayer? Do they both have campaigns sometimes? Yes, but they're not the same game. You know what I mean? Same genre, not the same game.
Press turns, standard stuff. If you've played an SMT Persona game, you're going to know how to play Metaphor. Target weaknesses, get extra turns to target said weaknesses. It can be interesting, but for most battles, you're just mashing your usual attacks over and over again. Maybe it's all just getting a little boring. Maybe it's just a me thing. I don't know.
I don't feel the same. I don't feel like you're just mashing the usual attacks over and over again in the battles. I don't know. I feel like there's enough variety in the battles. And honestly, that is a fair thing to note at the end there. Like, maybe it is a you thing. Maybe you are just a little bit fatigued of this type of game. I remember that when I played Persona 3 Reload, it was after Metaphor ReFantazio, and I do remember some of that fatigue setting in just a little bit, just because I had played it so close to when I had played Metaphor ReFantazio. I feel like with these games, I love all these games, but I would almost go so far as to say that I'm not sure they're meant to be played like back to back to back to back to back. Like, it is an immense effort to play these games. So I don't know. I could understand the idea that you're getting a little bit fatigued and that would impact your playthrough.
Archetypes. These are metaphors, personas. You cannot fuse them. That's right, no fusion in a Persona game, okay, whatever. But are they at least compelling? Not particularly, no. Archetypes level up and learn skills, just like Personas, and may inherit skills from other archetypes, just like Personas. But the process here is a bit more streamlined. In Persona or SMT, you might need to source several demons, Personas, and perform a chain of fusions. But here, you can just choose a skill and be done with it for a fee. Quicker, sure, but I can't help but feel like something is lost in streamlining this process, and tying unlocking these skill slots to advancing the archetype's follower bonds is a questionable decision. Unlike Persona titles, all party members may freely utilize any archetypes you have unlocked, rather than being locked into their own.
Okay, but that's not reality. Like, you established your own fictional reality and you're trying to push your reality on everybody else. This is not a Persona game. So stop saying it's a Persona game, because it's not. You can't be mad that the Persona game isn't acting like a Persona game when it's not a Persona game. Like, you say at the start that this game is so much like Persona that you consider it a Persona game, but then later on you're complaining about the things that it does differently than Persona. Well, gee, maybe it's doing stuff differently to Persona because it's not a Persona game.
I'm actually not a big fan of this personally. While it does afford you a lot more freedom in building your party, it feels like it cheapens the party's archetype awakening scenes and weakens each character's class fantasy. Overall, I feel that archetypes are a huge step down from the rest of the series, but those with no prior experience with Persona might not find these issues so glaring.
I mean, something I can honestly appreciate about this review is that it is very subjective. Like, not everything they're saying is out of pocket. A lot of it is, you know, their own opinion that they are free to. And I appreciate the fact that, you know, they're saying like personally, or in my opinion, or maybe it's just me. Like, I feel like I don't know, I just appreciate the way that they're speaking about their criticisms of this game. Like, I'm not gonna sit here and tell them that they're wrong for feeling that way about archetypes. I completely respect that that is their opinion. It's only when people say shit that like makes no sense and isn't rooted in reality that, you know, I'm gonna have an issue with it.
Synthesis. I really enjoy Synthesis, actually. For the cost of 2 turn icons, you can use powerful abilities by teaming up with another party member. Not a whole lot else to cover on this front, but it's neat.
Yeah, Synthesis is dope. I appreciate them shouting that out.
Follower bonds. They're just social links. Easier to keep track of. We'll call it a win, I guess. The followers themselves aren't exceptionally well written, but I mean, when have they ever been?
Okay. Oh, man. So, see, you ventured out of that subjective bubble, and then you said something that, in my opinion, just is very far from the truth, very far from reality. If y'all know me, y'all know that part of what we talk about a lot here on this channel is, you know, these characters and the game's story, and it's very well written. Like, there's a lot of depth, there's a lot of layers, there's a lot of symbolism. The characters are unique. They subvert tropes, they subvert expectations. It's just not true. And honestly, the rest of this statement saying when have they ever been, like, why are you here? Why are you talking about Persona and saying, you know, it's just another Persona? Why did you play those games if you don't think that they're well written? Like, that is such a core part of the experience. After all, a lot of these games you are reading because that is a core part of the experience. It's like that feeling that you are the main character of your own manga. Like, that is the essence of this series. So if you don't think it's well written, why do you keep coming back? Like, why do you keep coming back? That part I don't understand.
The calendar. I don't think Persona has ever done a great job making its deadlines feel urgent, and Metaphor is no exception. I've always felt that the series deadlines should encourage trade-offs, but when you can spreadsheet your way into getting everything done despite the limited time, it doesn't really feel limiting at all. It just feels like an unfun puzzle.
I mean, that's your own opinion, but it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. If you don't like the calendar system, and you never have, and you're just sitting here criticizing it, why do you play these games at all? If the calendar management is an unfun puzzle, like, why are you doing this to yourself? Just maybe take the next one off, you know? Like, it's okay. There's nobody forcing you to play these games. No.
So, yeah, mechanically, it's fine, I guess. It's a step down in some major ways, an improvement in some other minor ones. The story is okay. It's not terribly compelling. It lacks a sense of urgency. And while the political themes are interesting every now and then, the writers simply do not know how to depict racism. That would be okay if it wasn't, like, the most prevalent theme in the game.
Hard disagree that the story is okay and not compelling. The writers don't know how to depict racism. I mean, that's a pretty... I don't even know how to respond to that statement. As somebody who has read a lot about racism, has heard a lot about personal accounts of experienced racism, both from family and friends, as somebody who has experienced racism myself, I personally believe that the game does depict racism pretty well. But hey, shit, I mean, that's just my opinion, I guess. I didn't know it was possible to claim authority over what racism looked like. That's a new one to me.
But instead, you're beat over the head with utterly unnuanced schoolhouse rock-ass dialogue that fails to say anything of value.
I think if you feel like the dialogue in this game is not nuanced, then you fail to understand the dialogue in this game. It's not that there's a failing of the dialogue in this game having value, it's a failure on your part that you don't understand the dialogue in this game, to be honest. There's layers, there's subtleties, I assure you.
The setting, while visually interesting at times, is your typical JRPG pastiche, packed with the genre's usual tropes and cliches. It's not a terrible issue, but when your characters are boring, your story is uninteresting, and your game mechanics are tired, something has to carry the experience. I'm afraid nothing here is shouldering that burden. I'm still probably going to finish Metaphor, but it's the first SMT Persona game I've ever had to force myself to continue playing. Take from that what you will.
I'm not sure I believe you when you say it's the first SMT or Persona game that you've had to force yourself to continue playing. Based off of a lot of the things that you said in your review, it just feels like you hate these games and you play them just so that you're a part of the experience, and you can be that one person in the room who's like, well, I didn't actually like this game because XYZ. That's just my opinion though. I'm not actually sure, but I do appreciate that this comment at a lot of different points did take accountability in the sense that they said, you know, hey, it's just my personal opinion. It's just some of their opinions were just not rooted in reality, and we talked about those, but let's go to the next one.
I really want to like this game, but I just can't. I am a huge fan of the Persona series, and I had heard over and over again that this game is just as good, if not better, but I can't understand that thought process at all. First off, the combat has a really good skeleton, but it falls so flat mainly due to the enemy design. I'm at the second major boss of the game, and the boss has two attacks, and they don't even directly damage you. All the boss does is infinitely summon enemies and power them up. That's just not fun enemy design, and a lot of the enemies fall into this unfortunate design philosophy where they just have a couple of attacks that they spam, and it makes some of the fights tedious at best and downright miserable at worst.
This is where like reviews kind of don't make sense to me. It just feels like this review is, so far is very like niched down. Like you're saying you don't like this game based off of like such a specific thing. Like saying you don't like this game because the second boss in the game has two attacks and you don't like that, which by the way, I'm not even sure if that's actually true. I'd have to go back and play it, but I don't know, like if you're going to niche down that hard in a review of a game, at least have that super specific example be in support of an overarching point, and this just isn't. Like, it's not true that this reflects the design of all the enemies in the game.
Moving on to the music, I want to start off by saying the music isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it is so much more generic and forgettable compared to Atlus's other games. Metaphor also lacks the subtlety with its themes that Persona 5 nailed. With this lack of subtlety, the game sometimes can feel a little annoying with how in your face everything is, which is super sad to say because this game's themes are very interesting and topical. I want to end this by saying this game is not bad at all, but it's held back by certain design choices and decisions that lead this game to being a massive disappointment for me at least. I do understand why you would like this game, And if there is ever a sequel, I am there day one because this game does a lot of stuff good, but the stuff it doesn't do so good just ruins it for me. I do not understand how a single person could say this is a better Persona.
Again, we're at this impasse where like music is very subjective, right? And I don't think it's particularly fair to compare this game's soundtrack with Persona 5, if you will. Like, that's not fair to any game in general because that is the creme de la creme. So just not worth really saying more about. I completely disagree that there's a lack of subtlety with the themes in this game. Clearly the themes do possess a modicum of subtlety because so many people misunderstand them. I do want to respect the fact that they say that it's not a bad game. And I do want to respect the fact that they say they understand why somebody would like it. But at the same time, they sign off and they say that they don't understand how a single person could say this is a better Persona. So, I mean, if you don't understand how somebody could rate this game that highly, let's not pretend that you understand anything about this game. It's funny because they called the music in this game generic and forgettable, but this is probably the most generic and forgettable review that we've done so far. So let's go to the next one.
I love the Persona games. They are my all-time favorite series. In several ways, this is an improvement to those. But the fixes and improvements made the game boring with boring characters and miserable, predictable story.
If we keep refuting comments about the story, we're going to be beating a dead horse. And honestly, a simple way to prove how good this story is to just cite my other videos that I've done, to be completely honest. It goes in depth to a lot of the story beats and characters and really does them justice in terms of what the writer's visions were. So not even gonna engage with that beyond saying if the characters are boring, then you probably don't understand them.
There was not a plot line in the game that I did not predict after 20 minutes.
So let me get this straight. You're telling me that after 20 minutes, you knew that Rella cursed the prince because Forden told her to when she was a 12-year-old girl, and that Juna and Rella were sisters, and the reason that Rella acquiesced was because Juna's life was threatened. You're telling me after 20 minutes you knew that the protagonist was the prince's ideals formed from Magla. You're telling me after 20 minutes you met the guy, you figured that out. Be for real. Come on. It's just so disingenuous to me because you're sitting there saying shit like that and it's like, it's just not true. The story's not at a level where you could have predicted after 20 minutes all of these major story beats. I made a video before the game came out where I tried to predict the main story twist in the game, and that was solely based on the prologue because that was the demo and that was the only part that we could have played. And the main prediction that I made in that video was that Luis was not the person who cast a curse on the prince. My reasoning was that the person who cast the curse in the cutscene we watched, they run away from Hulkenberg and they get slashed in the back and they just, you know, try to escape. And Luis was basically characterized prior to that as a fucking demon, like off rip. So I didn't think that that fit the description of him as a character, but you know, my conclusion from that line of thinking was that it was Moore. I thought Moore was the person who cast the curse, and I thought Moore and Luis were brothers due to the similar character design and the fact that they seem to be like two figures towards the top of Uchronia in terms of their pull and power, and you know, just the idea that like society is like a pyramid, right? And towards the top of the pyramid, it gets closer and closer. So the idea is that if you're a very powerful person, then you're more likely to know other powerful people. It's the same concept as, you know, the president of a country meeting with the president of another country. It's just something natural that happens at that level of status and power. So I say all of that to convey that that was my prediction after like 9 hours of gameplay. I got it completely wrong. Like, you're telling me after 20 minutes you realized Luis was Zelda? What are we doing? Like, some people just be saying shit, man, and it's just so corny to me. It really is.
The fantasy world ruined the complexity in Persona, and this is one of the shallowest fantasy worlds I have seen. It says a lot about an RPG, where I did not really care about any of the characters. I am someone who cries constantly watching TV shows. Small connections can make me sympathies and love characters. But even after hundreds of hours, I did not care about a single character in this game.
Does it say something about the RPG, or does it say something about you?
I would say the more I got to know the characters, the less I cared about them. Some seemed really endearing early on, but the more I got to know them, the less real they seemed and the more like crude caricatures of real people.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest war crimes that we've seen on this list, to be honest. Calling the characters in this game crude caricatures is absolutely insane. I feel like I keep on talking about and citing other videos that I've done, but it's simply because I've talked about so many things about this game that refutes so many things that these people are saying. I'll just leave it at that. I've done character analysis videos for a lot of characters in this game. I don't think I'd be able to do that if they were crude caricatures. There's a lot of depth that goes into every single character in this game. Yeah, that's just ridiculous.
One of the worst, most repetitive dungeons and combat in any game. Will admit Persona combat is not its strong point, and I think this is just significantly worse. All dungeons in the game feel more similar than in any of the modern Persona games.
Okay, so the point on the dungeons, fair. I really don't agree on the combat. I think the combat in this game is really good.
The bosses were also really boring and made the combat almost entirely based on guessing the right weaknesses of the boss. And each boss was a roll of the dice. If you brought the right team, super easy. Otherwise, potentially impossible or extraordinarily tedious.
Okay, so every single part of this last blurb is a skill issue. A lot of these people just have skill issues. Like, they're talking about how combat's based on guessing the right weaknesses of the boss. They're talking about how it's a roll of dice if you brought the right team or not. Yeah, that's a fucking part of the gameplay. Like, planning for situations and planning before you get into the battle is literally a core part of the gameplay in these games. Like, that's just part of what you do. It's part of the fun. Planning for all of these scenarios and making sure that you're covered with each weakness and with each battle scenario that you can encounter. So, I mean, skill issue. Let's go to the next one.
It's hard to recommend this game because it has all the good and bad aspects of other Atlus games. The good. The gameplay is engaging. The turn-gaining, chart-losing mechanic is great. And more importantly, you can bypass underleveled mobs without battling them. This makes the game feel less tedious compared to previous Atlus titles. The art is stunning, especially the scenery and landscapes. Unlike Persona, where you're visually confined to cities, or SMT, where you're stuck in dungeons, this game lets you take in vast horizons, intricate architecture, and breathtaking nature. But unfortunately, that's about it. The bad. They mix gameplay elements from SMT and Persona with some improvements, which is nice, but the things that sucked before still suck now. I'm talking about the attribute weakness system. Why create so many attributes with corresponding weaknesses if later bosses just immune to all of them and force you to rely on a single damage type called Almighty?
Here we go with another skill issue. I'm sorry for how much of this video is about skill issues, but you're not forced to rely on Almighty. Like, the game is trying to encourage you to be creative, to find solutions, to not just do, you know, the song and dance where it's like, find the right element and strike the element. It's not telling you, oh, you can only use Almighty. It's telling you, have some ingenuity about it, you know? Use Juna, use the Masked Dancer archetype line, create weaknesses, and then follow up with Yufa with elemental attacks. It's like the game gives you opportunities to really get creative, and some of you just don't take it. Some of you don't think outside the box, and then you cry about the fact that the game is hard and it's ultimately just a skill issue.
It completely undermines the depth of the system. Stupid storytelling. The statement, Japanese studios can't make good open-world or mature political games, has never felt more accurate. Atlus wanted to separate this game from Persona and SMT, creating a new franchise with a full fantasy setting and a mature story, even desexualizing female characters to reinforce this direction.
Desexualizing female characters? Huh? I'm not sure I understand that one. That's really throwing me for a loop. I don't understand the idea that female characters in this game are desexualized. I feel like they're just people. I don't know. Do we need a hot tub scene where they whip their titties out? Like, I feel like they're just people, and I'm good with that on my end. I don't know about that idea that they're desexualized. That's weird.
But oh boy, the first half of the game revolves around a team blindly following an old man's vague claims, almost leading to their failure. Why does no one on the team question Grius' statement? The entire team feels like a sack of potato heads.
This is just a misunderstanding of the game's story. They're not blindly following Grius' claims. Literally, everybody at the Elden Sanctum put Gallica on the path that, you know, Luis has got to go because they need to kill the caster or, you know, find the recipe for the curse. That doesn't come from Grius. Also, I don't understand what you mean when you say almost leading to their failure. I truly do not understand that. Them building power to be worthy of clashing with Luis and spending all of that time, you know, learning to work together and be effective together and going across the kingdom and helping all of the people across the kingdom and growing their standing with the public. Like, all of these things that stem from the mission to kill Luis ended up enabling them to be successful in the overarching goal of fixing the broken world. So I don't really understand that. I don't understand the idea that it almost led to their failure. It's weird.
Too lengthy. The build-up takes up about 2/3 of the total playtime, with tons of unnecessary dialogue that repeats what we just learned a moment before. It feels like the writer had to hit a word count and stretched it out as much as possible.
Too lengthy? So again, it's like, maybe this game just isn't for you. Like, if you know about yourself that you can't handle a game that's longer than 20 hours, if you know about yourself that you can't handle a game where there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of story being told, if you can't handle that, then that's not a fault of the game. It's just something that you have personally that means that that game probably isn't for you. There are games that I know that aren't for me. Like, I wouldn't go and play a horror game because I know that I personally wouldn't enjoy it. It's just a similar concept here. It's like, you have these people who just come and try to play these games, and it's just like, they just, I don't know why they're playing them. Like, are you playing it just to be a part of the community? I guess if you are, that's completely fair. But it's like, if you're playing it and you're saying like, oh, these games are, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's just weird to play these games and then complain about a core element of these games. Like, I don't want to hear you complaining about the calendar system. I don't want to hear you complaining about the dialogue in this game. I don't want to hear you complaining about social links. Like, these are core parts of these games that make these games these games. If you don't like it, the game's just probably not for you. Like, and that's okay.
Repetitive monsters. I guess this is because it's a new franchise. So the developers had to create new monster, unlike Persona or SMT, which have a long-established history.
I do agree on the repetitive monster point. I've spoken about that before. I do wish there was more variety in the enemies that you encounter in this game, specifically the mini-bosses. Like, that would have been a really big boon if, you know, maybe the mobs were a lot of copy and paste, but at least the mini-bosses were all unique. Like, the bounties were very disappointing in my book.
Weak antagonists. Luis is too perfect, so sublime that he becomes surreal, incomprehensible, and ultimately boring. Meanwhile, the other major faction, the Church, is introduced as a dangerous force at the beginning, but barely gets any screen time before being wiped out in 3 consecutive cutscenes by Luis.
Oh man. Okay, so I did a character analysis on Luis. He is not perfect. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on with Luis, and I'm not even gonna spend time calling Luis boring is insane, actually. And I just disagree. I think factually the church and the church's elements do get screen time within the game. I think the Senate is definitely wasted, but we see the faction throughout cutscenes. We see Rella, we see Forden. We do see the church throughout the game, so I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that they don't get screen time.
I was about 25 hours when I put it down for the last time a few months ago. It felt like I was nearing the halfway mark or maybe further, but I don't think I'll ever launch it again. I wouldn't say it's a terrible game either, just not a great one.
Can I just pause and say that it's kind of a weirdo move to stop playing a game and then a few months later come back and, you know, talk shit about it with your chest? Like, that's just kind of weird to me. Like, you just randomly wake up one day and you're like, I feel like hating on something. And then you go to Steam and just go in, like, I don't know, just strange, in my opinion.
For positives, runs well enough on the Steam Deck. The UI art for the main menu is gorgeous, and the voice acting was pretty decent. It wasn't a fully stable FPS, though.
Well, I mean, we agree that the UI is fucking dope. The voice acting is beyond pretty decent. Stop it. You can say that it's excellent. I know you want to.
I had a lot of small issues, so here's what I remember. The time day system felt a fair bit out of place. Big Bad is taking over X. Get to the front door, there's a gate. Let's go home and talk about it and try again tomorrow. The most dissonant part especially was the airship, top secret infiltration mission. The concept was go in, avoid, beat up guards, they fall asleep. Beat up a head honcho, steal their key, then go back. Repeat this 3 times. The issue with this is you could spread it out over the course of 2 weeks and none of the guards would ever mention anything. The big bad NPCs would never tell anyone either. The dissonance got me, and things like this kill it for me personally.
Okay, so again, it's like, I don't mind the time day system. I like hearing like flame stay and stuff like that. I feel like in this game, the time day system did, it did play an integral part in, you know, giving you a sense of urgency because of, they gave you that Prince graphic constantly of, you know, him and the curse, and then they also gave you some lore as well with, again, stuff like flame stay and whatnot. So I do appreciate the time day system in this game, and also what we talked about before. Like, it's a part of the genre. It's a part of the game. It has a place here. With that said, I do completely agree on the the part about the guard mission. So that is pretty dissonant. I think for me that I didn't get this dissonance because I played the entire dungeon in one go. So I didn't have that moment where it was like I left the ship and I came back and like guards were still sleeping like 20 days later. That wasn't my experience. I guess I do wish that they had put a little bit more thought into that segment to help players like this who might have been leaving the dungeon and revisiting the dungeon. They probably should have locked it so that you could only do this dungeon in one day. But you know, that's a pretty small thing to me in my book. Like, that's not grounds to not like the game. You know what I mean? Like, this one little segment.
The plot feel weak and tropey after the start. A dude in our party tried humanizing a char who fed hundreds of thousands of people to a giant head because he too lost a child. As well as a lot of chars having very flimsy backstories I just didn't really get into, written in the exact same format you've seen many times before. If you've never played Persona or SMT, think Fire Emblem A ranks.
Okay, well, I feel like you probably... I don't know this person, and I could be completely wrong, but just based on this little comment right here, it definitely reads as someone who's pretty privileged and hasn't gone through a lot of trial in life, that they are lashing out because Haisme can relate to Joanna. I don't know, it just feels like you're probably lacking a little bit of life experience that you can't feel. I don't know, I feel like I'm the type of person where I can feel empathy and I can feel sympathy for somebody while also in the same breath being like, yeah, fuck you, you gotta, you know, fix your shit, and this is not fucking okay. Like, it's not black and white. Both things can coexist at the same time, and this feels like a very black and white comment. Like, she committed horrible crimes, so Haisme should not be, you know, trying to connect with her. Like, that's a black and white way of thinking. Flimsy backstories, agree to disagree. I think you sound dumb, but I mean, clearly you would think that I sound dumb for the way that I praise these characters, so, you know, fair play, agree to disagree.
Gameplay-wise, if you've come from a background of Persona games or SMT, it's basically that. Coupled with the very largely monotonous dungeons that made me remember bleak dungeons like the original King's Field games, I just wasn't into those aspects at all. Also, after you're about 10% into the game, there's basically no new music for fights or anything for a long time. It starts to get very samey.
Fair play with the dungeons. I feel like the main dungeons weren't horrible. The side dungeons were pretty bad, but I could understand if you were bored with the dungeon gameplay in this game. That's fair to me. I do kind of agree on the music point. I do wish there was more music variety. That part does kind of hurt me still to this day.
And lastly, the cheapest feeling part was the rider location you had later on. It would look like it was running, but if you paid attention for like 5 seconds, you would see you were running in a circle in the same area to give the illusion LOL. I will add that Galika making music you're hearing canon is the coolest flipping thing though.
And this is, again, this just feels like nitpicky and unnecessary. It's like, are you even trying to enjoy the game? Like, why are you just sitting on the gauntlet runner and staring at the background and waiting for a gotcha moment? Like, that's just corny to me. I don't know. It's just like, can you try a little bit to like the game that you're spending time playing? You know what I mean?
This game turned out to be a colossal disappointment.
Colossal disappointment is crazy.
The story felt weak and uninspired, its themes spelled out with no nuance or subtlety.
I do believe there is quite a bit of nuance and subtlety, again, in this game's themes, this game's characters, and I do think that, ironically, it's lost on the people who say that there isn't any because they don't have the, I don't want to say intelligence, but the literary comprehension to understand the themes and understand the nuance in this game. And honestly, that kind of reminds me of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I think is probably one of the most prevalent issues in society in general. For those who don't know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, it's basically like a cognitive bias where people with low competence in a specific area tend to overestimate their abilities, while those with high competence often underestimate their skills, or they're more aware of their skills. So it's basically the idea that like the more you learn about something and the more you gain expertise in something, the better understanding you have of like your true standing in that specific thing. So it's like the idea of, let's say sports, somebody is from a small town in the country and they're the best basketball player in town, right? This person goes on in life, they stop playing basketball and they go on in life assuming that they're extremely good at basketball because they were better than everybody else in their town. But in reality, they're really not good at all. They're just a basic player. Whereas somebody who is from like a bigger town and, you know, was pretty good at their town and good enough to do AAU and travel and to end up going to, you know, a Division II or a Division I basketball school. So these people will have played with people who end up being pros and end up, you know, hitting the highest levels. So these people understand that they're actually, you know, they're good, but there's a big gulf between them and the absolute top people in their field. And they understand this because they were good enough on the curve to be in those rooms with the people who were towards the top. So that's an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I feel like that's kind of adjacent to the people who play this game and they claim that the story beats you over the head with its themes, or the story lacks nuance, or the story lacks subtlety. It's like these people don't have the depth of literary comprehension to understand the hidden symbolisms, to understand the themes that it's telling you about, to understand its messages at its core. And so they just assume that the literal surface level of this game, you know, walking down the street and seeing like a therapist being abused, they just think that surface level of storytelling, that surface level of racism is all that this game is talking about, because they lack the comprehension to understand the deeper levels, the deeper layers of what you can actually, you know, find in this game's story and find in this game's characters. So yeah, long story short, I do believe that you know, Dunning-Kruger effect is one of the pandemics when it comes to I feel like people in general, but that's a random tangent.
Side quests were boring and tedious. And it is good when a game tackles mature themes, but it felt like writers thought that everything needs to be spelled out in great detail. Main characters literally draw powers from being the goodiest boy you could be. And as you get your good boy points in various good boy disciplines, you avatar of goodness becomes stronger.
Yeah, here we have just a fundamental lack of understanding when it comes to royal virtues. Just a really weird lack of understanding. There's no point in this game where they say that you become stronger from doing good deeds. That's literally just not a thing in this game.
This is not interesting from the start, and I doubt it will become interesting later, because what incentive do main characters have to deviate from the good path? They literally become stronger from being good, and the writing is not good enough to tell a good story about just good people doing good things.
And it's very ironic, this statement about the writing, because it is a good story about good people doing good things. So that's ironic that they said that like that. Or I would actually adjust that to saying it's a good story about people trying to do good things, because, you know, Luis is trying to do good things in his estimation, and that's part of what makes it compelling.
On another hand, gameplay is boring and boils down to spam your most effective attack, which hits exploits weakness. You either have the levels and attacks that let you complete encounter, or you don't, and you should get back to the grind. Enemy variety in dungeons is poor. Dungeons are just a straight line with mobs, etc. The only good thing about Metaphor is the soundtrack, but you can listen that without paying for the hours of poorly written story and mindless dungeon grinding. All in all, I don't recommend it to anyone.
Skill issue, doesn't understand the gameplay. I can't disagree with the dungeons, like, and that'll be like the universal thing. I agree with the dungeons could have used some work, honestly. Yeah, this game wasn't for this person, just that's okay. Hello, I'm back. My camera died last night, so I'm finishing this video today. Something came from my office, which I think is really cool, but anyone who's been here for a long time, I'm talking like OG, I'm talking like before I even hit 100 subscribers, they know that I really, really like Makoto. So yeah, I think this is really cool and it'll fit into the office pretty well here. But yeah, getting distracted, let's get back into this nonsense.
I started out really enjoying this game, but ended up hating it. Don't believe all the gaudy hype. I started playing this game in January, and it's taken me 2 whole months to slog my way through it, even after deciding to skip everything around the 65% completion mark. The only reason I completed it too was because of the sunk cost fallacy, time and money invested. Now this review is for those of us who are largely unfamiliar with the Persona SMT series. I played the game quite efficiently, making smart use of archetypes and items to ensure I could beat the dungeons first try and have more time for maxing out stats and bonds. Turns out, this is stupid, as you will end up massively underleveled by the endgame. You need to repeat dungeons or grind respawning enemies quite a lot to stay relevant, or you will be forced to lower the difficulty at some point. A quick search online or the Steam forums shows many people also encountered this issue.
So people just be saying shit and acting like just because they said it, it's truth. I don't think I would describe how you played the game as efficiently. It kind of sounds like you basically kind of ratted your way through the dungeons just to try to like eke out victories and make it through, when in reality, if you had just taken your time a little bit and spent some time, you know, running battles and hitting save points and running battles to build up your experience, then it would have been a more natural progression. It would have been a more natural playthrough. Honestly, I don't have any issue with the I don't even know if I would call it a difficulty spike in the later stages of the game. It definitely feels like the point of the later stages of the game is to test how much you've familiarized yourself with the game systems and to test your understanding of the game, which I think is completely appropriate for an end game. Honestly, I played through this game as a parent of a baby, so I did not have a lot of time. And I'm telling you from my own personal experience, it didn't feel like an insane grind for me to maintain my level to the point where I could survive in the later stages of the game and make it through things pretty organically. So I'm not sure where this notion comes from, where people are saying that the grind is like immense or you have to like repeat battles over and over and over again. I don't know, I was trying to play through the game pretty quickly and I made it through just fine personally, but that just might be a difference in skill, to be honest. I just feel like in the most literal sense, you don't need to spend that much time in each dungeon grinding up your levels in order to be successful in the end game. That's my take on it.
I felt like I was punished for playing well. I had done every side quest, beat every enemy in every dungeon once only, but ended up game-breakingly underleveled towards the latter third of the game.
So you contradict yourself right here within these two statements. You say that you played well and you were punished for it, but at the same time you say that you only beat every enemy in every dungeon once. So that is just not how this genre works, like in any of these RPGs. The game is not designed to be a speedrun where you only fight everybody once. Literally, this is just how the genre works. You gain experience through battle, and you do the battles as much as you're comfortable with so that you're at a comfortable level to beat the boss. Like, this is just the most classic part of the entire genre, so I wouldn't consider it a fair critique of this game because that's just how it works. Like, we could go all the way back to fucking Pokemon Blue, right? It's a very core part of RPGs, right? Like, in Pokemon, you catch Pokemon and you train them up. How do you train them up? You do wild encounters over and over again. You fight Pokemon out in the wild. You try to find trainers that you can fight, also that you can beat the trainer who is at the gym at the end of that, you know, town. So it's like, that's just a very fundamental core essence to these games. You know what I mean? Like, you go through the combat, you play the gameplay, you just vibe out, you have a good time, and you do it until you're ready to beat the checkpoint that is the boss at the end. So I don't think that's a fair critique.
Okay, so now that you know to grind, is the game worth playing? Well, emo, no. It has terrible segmented dungeons, reused assets galore. The combat is frustratingly limiting.
I can't disagree on the used assets, but the combat is definitely not limiting. I think the combat really did a great job of being a blank canvas where you could really get creative and approach battles in different ways.
The characters and writing all suffer from major anime tropes.
So obviously my biggest issue and my biggest disagreement is, as always, the criticism of the characters and the criticism of the story. I just flat out, I don't put any credence towards that. I definitely don't think this is a game that employs major anime tropes, and I do think that they actually managed to subvert a lot of tropes. Not that subverting tropes is the key metric to a game being good, it's just what I continually see is people saying that it follows a pre-established formula or it follows a trope, and that's just not true. This game is clever, it's inventive in terms of the story.
The pacing can be glacial. It feels like a really cheap game masquerading quite successfully as something a lot better.
That point on the pacing, okay, so this game doesn't have bad pacing at all by any metric. For example, Persona 3. I think across the entire spectrum of people who have played Persona 3, whether you love it and it's your absolute favorite, or if you're more towards the other side and you didn't enjoy it as much, I think we can all, I hope, we can all agree that the pacing in that game probably wasn't the best for the first half. That's probably where it suffers the most if we're looking at that game objectively. I think probably the pacing was a little bit wonky and a little bit, it left a little bit to be desired. I don't think that's the case with Metaphor ReFantazio. I don't think this is a game that suffers from glacial pacing whatsoever. I think from the jump, there is always something happening that you are learning something, or it's intriguing, or there's a seed being planted for a storyline that will, you know, kind of develop later on in the story. And I think the credence and the truth to that statement is probably most supported by the fact that they released that demo and so many people, you know, loved the demo and were high on the demo, and the sales speaks for themselves for this game. So I think most people who have played this game would at least concede that the pacing is pretty good in terms of from the start to the end of the game. There's always something interesting happening, and there's always stories that are flowing and progressing in a manner that's satisfying.
The beautiful cutscenes and music have probably pushed the critics' scores high, but once you get into the meat of it, it's really mediocre. I can't objectively say that it's bad, and honestly, unfortunately, I can't really comment on the story as I stopped paying attention when it lost me.
Okay, so this last part is... not to be harsh, but this last part is why this is my least favorite type of person. I'm just not a fan of people who are so blatantly confident in their ignorance. I don't like people who are closed off to hearing opposition viewpoints. I don't like people who are just not willing to have an open mind. And I feel like this last part is really kind of showcasing those traits. They say that they can't really comment on the story because they stopped paying attention when it lost them. Yet at the same time, up above, they were saying that the game suffered from anime tropes and that the pacing was glacial. So like, which is it? Were you paying attention to the story, or did you stop paying attention and you know nothing that's happening? It can't be both at the same time, but this is just a scenario where it's like, it seems like this person didn't really understand what was happening, and so they're just now saying it with their chest that just because I don't understand this, it's not good. And I don't appreciate that trait in people personally, honestly. And it's also just a weird take claiming that the cutscenes push this game high. I think a lot of us would say that the cutscenes are probably one of the weaker points of this game. Like, even the anime cutscenes, they're not as clean as, like, if you watch anime, you know that they're really not super clean. They're okay, they're passable, but they're definitely not the boon of this game. There's no chance. And obviously the music we've already talked about at length, but it's very subjective. But a lot of us, can look at this and say it's a great score, great soundtrack, but it's definitely, I wouldn't say definitely, it's probably not the best that they've done. So it's just a weird take to me that that's your take. You think the cutscenes and the music carry this game. Okay. But yeah, this review was just all over the place because they say that they've done every side quest. They say that they beat every enemy in every dungeon. But at the same time, at the very start, they're like, well, I decided to skip everything at the 65% completion mark. So it's like, which is it? Did you complete everything, or did you just decide to fly through things around the 65% completion mark? Like, which is it? Based off of your playtime, I would assume you've completed everything, but then you go on to talk about the story and criticize that. If you're skipping through I was always bad at math. If you're skipping through 35% of the story, then you're probably not positioned well to have a critical analysis of the story or to claim that the story does XYZ. You wouldn't know. You didn't pay attention to the story, and you don't have a right to be speaking on it. Now, you can come from a place of, I didn't like this story. I would love somebody to, explicate to me why this story is good, or explicate to me what the themes are in this game and what they're trying to accomplish. But you don't. Instead, you just speak with your chest with a willful ignorance that is just, I don't know, it's definitely one of my pet peeves. I think it's corny. I just think it's corny. So yeah, definitely don't respect this review at all.
This game is awful. There's many things speaking for this game, like the good combat design in itself, world building and story, the design especially. But oh my god, it's so awful to walk through a 3-hour-long dungeon with like 200 mana points. Once you get to a certain point, you'll most likely not have enough to fight a boss with abilities. There's a mage that lets you restore 1 MP for every enemy knocked in overworld combat. But once you get to a room with like 10 enemies in it, and they all attack you at the same time while you have to fight them, to get some MP back for a big fight, they will most likely randomly hit you from the back, and either make you lose HP, so you have to restore them with MP, or you have to use MP to kill them in battle.
So this is one of those people where it's like, if you don't like this type of game, just don't play it. My first impression is that this reads like this person just got destroyed by a boss or something, and they're just raging now in the review section, because they say it has good combat design, world building, and story, which, I mean, that's a lot of a game. Like, those are some very important factors for a game. But then the next blurb, they talk about how it's awful to walk through 3-hour-long dungeons. So, I mean, it's like, do you enjoy these things that you're saying you enjoy, or do you not enjoy the things that you're saying that you enjoy? Because this is just the game. Going through the dungeon, save points, managing mana, like these are all systems that make the experience, right? Like, it's a part of the game to manage your mana, because that paints a different color through all of your combat encounters. You have to think through your combat encounters based off of how much mana you have, and you know, that pre-planning, that constant, okay, should I use this attack, or will I be able to skate through if I just hit a melee attack instead? And what's more valuable to me right now, sacrificing some health or sacrificing some mana? These are all a part of the gameplay experience. So it's like, if you don't like these things, if you don't like the complexity of it, then you just, the game, the genre itself is just not for you. This is not an indictment on the game itself. That's all I'm trying to say.
Keep in mind, I am playing on hard mode, but still there's no reason for you to not be able to restore MP before a big battle. Really stupid design and one part that destroys the whole game for me.
Yeah, maybe just check your ego at the door. Based off of the stuff you're saying in this review, there's no reason for you to be playing on hard mode. You might actually want to play on safe mode, to be honest, based off of some of the comments you made. This is just a skill issue in the form of a review, to be honest. It's not stupid design just because you're not good at it. It's just, in fact, it's actually a game design that a lot of us enjoy.
Note, the game is high quality, but the low point of the Atlus catalog. Unless you find the setting more appealing, just play any of the Persona games first. I did not foresee myself not recommending this. I am a huge fan of Persona and Atlus games in general, and early on I thought the game was a cozy masterpiece.
Okay, so this review is interesting because they start out the gates and say the game is high quality. They say that they're a fan of Atlus games, and they say that there was a point where they thought it was a masterpiece. So I'm going to be intrigued to see how we arrive to a thumbs down.
Let me sum up my grievances. 1. Combat is frustrating. Removing all-out attacks and causing block, repel, miss to cost 2 extra turns adds a layer of frustration, not challenge. If you play on hard, you'll probably just Alt F4 if this happens.
Okay, so the complaint about combat, that's just a skill issue. I know I'm like a broken record saying that, but I don't know. It would just never be me. I would never be bad at something and then blame the game. You know what I'm saying? It's like if I were to play soccer and then my team loses like 5-0 and all the goals are my fault, and then I'm in the car ride home and I'm like, yo, that game is so stupid. Like, the game makes no sense. I can't believe that the rules are that I can't pick up the ball and run with it. That's so dumb. It's like, no. I would just take personal accountability at my skill level and say, I got to get better. Let me find ways to get better. So it's just weird that this is such a, it really feels like a prevalent cognitive dissonance where a lot of gamers just say a game is ass because they're not good at it and they don't understand it. I definitely, there's just a difference between when a game is broken or when a game design makes no sense versus when you just don't have the skill required to navigate it.
Second, ham-fisted messaging on race relations. Along with FFX VI, recent JRPGs have had a weird thirst to handle a complex topic that is easy to fumble, not to mention one that someone from a largely homogeneous island country will need to work extra hard to understand. It's handled mostly okay here, but the story does not benefit from the inclusion.
Okay, so this is an interesting point. I would need them to say more because genuinely I don't know what the fuck they're trying to say. Like, I really don't. I guess they're basically saying that a Japanese person wouldn't understand how to talk about racism, which is a very interesting take. And they're saying it with conviction. I'd be curious to know, you know, it's entirely possible that the writing team did consult other people from other backgrounds as they were creating this narrative. Honestly, as somebody who has studied this game at length, there are so many references to so many different cultures, to so many different time periods across human history. These people really did their fucking homework. Like, they have studied a lot. So I'm not sure if myself personally, even if it was just Japanese people who wrote this game, I'm not sure if I myself personally would be like, well, it's automatically invalid because you guys are Japanese, so you can't make a video game that, you know, talks about why racism and discrimination are not good things. You know what I mean? It's also a weird take to say that the story doesn't benefit from the inclusion of race relations, because that's kind of like a core element to this game. I feel like I keep on throwing the same like parallels, but I feel like saying this game doesn't benefit from the inclusion of talking about racial relations and discrimination is kind of similar to playing Call of Duty and then leaving and being like, I feel like this game doesn't benefit from having guns in it. Like, it's a core part of the game. I don't understand what you're trying to say.
3. The story gets lost in itself. The story tries to tackle friendship, anxiety, hope, facing your fears, racism, and prejudice, and all through this lens of fiction, fantasy as a metaphor. But it's unfocused and feels like a jumbled mess of talking points tumbling through the dryer.
So this is interesting. I feel like, so it's like as somebody who understands this story, I hear this, I read unfocused, jumbled mess. I read that and I read it went over my head and there's too much going on, and I kind of understood it, but I also didn't understand it because they were talking about a lot of different concepts. That's what I read. It almost feels like you wanted like a very simple fairy tale with the way that you're talking, because you don't want racial relations talked about in this game, and then you also feel like it tackles too many points. Like if you want to play like just a traditional story with not a lot of themes and not a lot of nuance and not a lot of complexity, then there's plenty of game stories out there that are like that. So no need to say that this game story isn't good just because you don't understand it. It's all good.
You'll notice the opening sequence includes modern-day Tokyo. Why? I still couldn't quite tell you. Yes, I know the story, a reason why, but couldn't tell you what the point of this was.
I mean, like, there you go. They even concede that they don't understand why modern-day Tokyo was included in the opening segment. There's a clear lack of understanding for the story and, you know, everything that was involved there. So I don't appreciate when people frame their ignorance as the fault of the other party or the topic or the external force that they're ignorant about. Don't appreciate it.
Possibly only me things. I personally find the art amazing yet unappealing. I'm not sure why. I really wanted to like it, but it didn't connect. I recall Atlus saying this was the longest RPG they've ever made. It's nowhere near the length of a Persona game, and is paced a little strangely. You are just sort of mid-journey, get your last party member, then it's the end of the game.
Okay, I do appreciate that they said possibly only me things at the end. That does, you know, give at least a shred of accountability and a shred of, you know, understanding that maybe they just don't have the current disposition and current knowledge to really take this game in for what it is. And that's another thing too. When I say like all of these things, when I say like skill issue, or I say somebody just doesn't understand something, I don't see people as static. And I'm not saying that these games should never be for those people. I'm saying maybe there's just some work you got to do on yourself before you can, you know, appreciate this story for what it is. I'll give an example. Like if you watch shows from when you were younger versus when you are now, it's very interesting to see how differently you feel about things. Like I'll give you an example. One of my favorite shows ever is Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? And when I watched it as a kid, I was a young kid, I really couldn't stand Katara. But when I rewatched it as an adult, I realized all of the different things that she was doing for the group to keep them together, and I didn't find her annoying, whereas when I was a kid, I did. So it's like, I feel like that's such a great example of maybe you're just not in the right point of life experience to understand a lot of the things that this game is talking about. And that's okay. Just don't frame that as this game is a mess and it doesn't make sense and yada yada yada. It's like the dude who was talking shit about Heismay connecting with Joanna. It's like, maybe you just lack the life experience to understand the gravity of that moment. Maybe you just lack the life experience to have established that internal barometer of empathy to understand what they were going for with that moment. So yeah, I don't know. Saying that you get Basilio and then it's the end of the game is kind of wild. There's a lot of game after you get Basilio, but yeah, it's like I would have a lot more respect if the negative reviews were all framed like the last section of this person's review, right? Just have that little bit of admission that, hey, this is probably my opinion, or, you know, these are just my personal thoughts, or maybe I'm just missing something, as opposed to just, you know, screaming with your chest that the game's bad. Like, stop it. It's not bad, in my opinion. And then last one. All right, last review.
Skip button is the same as the pause button.
I take back everything I said. This game's horrible.
It was good talking to you, too.
You know what, lad? You're all right. You ever need some good, honest work? I'll get you squared, eh?